Okay, remember that they're changing my voice. In this video series, I'll be talking about Zechariah and Malachi. And I'll explain to you why the Jews are wrong about how the Torah ends. I've never even heard of a Jew who gets it right. So as we look at the last books in the Torah or the Old Testament, you'll see definitively that I am right and that they're wrong. And they were very foolish, those of them who were involved, those of them who approve of it, those of them who didn't lift a finger to stop it, and none of them lifted a finger to stop it. They were very foolish to persecute me and try to make it seem like I'm gay or crazy. That is very childish. That is very foolish. Okay? Very silly to represent for their people, acting like Borat or Mr. Bean or Rick Moranis or the villain who tries to poison the protagonist in The Princess Bride. Very, very foolish. And I'm sure their ancestors will be very angry at those people involved and at the rest of their groups for not scrambling to change the situation. So we know from Isaiah 28:17 that the end of the Torah, which represents for the end of the Bible, it connects to Revelation, where we're talking about the Torah in the Old Testament here, that it has to end in a way that reflects that God is just. The prophets went on and on about how God is just and how the Jews, the Israelites, the tribe of Judah, what have you, how they were doing the wrong thing. It went on and on. Moses, Hosea, Zechariah, Zephaniah, Haggai, Obadiah, Malachi, Jeremiah. They went on and on. You see it in Leviticus. You see it in Deuteronomy. You see it in Exodus. You see it in Genesis. And God is constantly reasserting the fact that He's just. So the interpretation of the ending of the Bible must reflect morally precise justice. As we see in both Zechariah and Malachi, that God says He's going to refine those that He chooses to take with Him, and the rest of them will be discarded. That is key in how the story ends. We see it in Isaiah, we see it in Jeremiah. All the prophets point to an ending where the wicked are screened out and the righteous are taken to heaven. We see when God elevates other peoples in the Old Testament that the justice, the opportunity to go to heaven isn't limited to the Jews. Even before the New Testament, we see that in the Old Testament. So when the Old Testament ends with Malachi, which is actually a play on words for my name, Emeka, right? When we consider the cryptograms and anagrams in the Bible, we see that the righteous are said to rejoice and the wicked are said to be trampled. And in the New Testament, Christ as a character in the story is right to say you know them by their works. So before we even translate anything, we must know that the ending must be consistent with God's justice, with true justice, with morally precise justice, because God created justice. He doesn't have a special scale for people who are religious. He created justice in general, right? Do not steal. Do not kill unfairly. Do not be an idolater. Honor holy ideas, which is what is embodied by the idea of honoring the Sabbath. These are universal and straightforward. Do not covet things you shouldn't covet. People chose to be covetous, to be idolaters, to be covered in iniquity and disgrace. So how the story actually ends, we know for sure, is that the world is blocked off from heaven. We see that in Zechariah, where a house is built for those who chose Babylon instead of choosing God. It covers the whole world, and they're sealed into it. So now let's consider what the opposition view might say. Some might say, hey, you don't know what you're talking about, right? It's talking about Israel in this world. It doesn't make sense. Israel in this world was founded on sin. Over many years, the Jewish people have not become holy. There's not a single holy Jewish person on this planet. We look at the lesson of the Tower of Babel, right? What were they doing? They were building on wickedness. They were building on their own motives instead of on God's plan, which is what the Jews in this planet are doing right now. And this video is not about being anti-Semitic or something. It's about clarifying how the story ends. And I have more of a claim to the story than anyone because I'm the most righteous person with a universal scale. Okay, and the story is about the righteous trampling the wicked, where the Jews are being made an example. As God is communicating to the Jews, he's also communicating to other peoples in various ways. We see that with Pharaoh. We see that with Assyrians and Babylonians. We see that time and time again, and sometimes through the Jews, like David versus Goliath, right? The prophet Samuel, the way he tells it, we see that David is communicating on behalf of God to Goliath. This is all very important here. We see in Proverbs that it says a prudent servant will rule over a disgraceful son. So the Old Testament isn't just about the Jews, it's about mankind in general. And people are judged according to their deeds, okay, according to whether they are obeying universal morals, which is what the Ten Commandments is about. It's about universal morals. And time again, they were warned about breaking the covenant. If they break the covenant, they lose their privileged status. They broke it and they lost it. And that's what Malachi says. That's what it says in Zechariah. It says, you broke the covenant, so your blessings are cursed. Pretty straightforward. We see that Jacob messed up. We see that David messed up. We see that God's justice comes into play. They write in the New Testament when they said, to the one who much is given, much is expected. That is something that they got from the Old Testament. That is summing up a lot of the lessons from the Old Testament, where David went wrong with his covetous activity, sending someone off to die so he can have his wife. Where Jacob went wrong, tricking Esau. Okay, God's justice ultimately comes down on the heads of the Jews because they refuse to follow God's plan meticulously, like a great warrior. What is a warrior? Somebody who disciplines himself, a true warrior, to fight with a certain efficacy and fights for the highest cause. Jacob was not behaving like a warrior. Neither was David. And at key points, there was no one hacking their brain, okay? They had no excuse. It was just their mere temptations overcame them. And they did people wrong, people on their side, people they should not have done wrong. And as the Jews as a group kept being idolatrous and they kept killing the prophets, we see that the story ends with a prudent servant ruling over a disgraceful son, because Proverbs is for understanding the books in the Bible, especially the Old Testament. What is the lesson from Proverbs 17? What is the lesson from Proverbs 1? When you lie in wait to cheat everybody, there has to be consequences. They broke the covenant, and so therefore, they have to follow another people. You might say, well, how do you know? When they were taken into captivity in Egypt, why was that? Because they did things that were wrong. When they're taken into Babylonian captivity, why was that? Because they did things that were wrong. When they fought battles, maybe against each other, for example, and they lost those battles, why didn't God have them win the first time? Because they did things that were wrong. Because God's justice transcends the flesh. The covenant was a spiritual covenant. The covenant was a divine and spiritual covenant. And before the covenant with the Jews, God had dealings with Noah, and he had dealings with Nimrod. And Nimrod was a mighty warrior before the Lord. Why would his offspring be forsaken, but the Jews not be forsaken? Why would the offspring of Noah in general be forsaken and not given another chance, where the Jews magically aren't? You see, when you don't interpret it in a just and moral way, you are following the devil. And so the Torah, like the Bible and the Quran, they're made in a way where if you really have a just heart, you'll interpret it the way I'm interpreting it the first time. When God said, thou shalt not kill, why didn't he write a whole book about why the different ways to kill and when not to kill? Because it goes without saying. When he wrote that you must honor the Sabbath, why didn't he go into detail? Because it goes without saying. So God's justice is universal. The Ten Commandments definitively prove that. And so it is with the interpretation of the book. The story ends with me as the most righteous person that ever lived. That's how the Old Testament ends as well. And you don't need the New Testament to understand that. And it ends with the people in this world who won't stop reproducing, going to hell for rebellion. Because they looked at the situation. They knew they kept trying to cheat people. We see it in Proverbs 9. They kept going after this ill-gotten gains. They kept reproducing in the spirit of ill-gotten gains. Okay, and now little do they know that they're in the realm of the dead. They and their guests are in the realm, the top level of hell, and when their flesh dies, it will be made crystal clear to them. And the smoke from their torment will rise forever and ever. The worm that devours them will never be satisfied. The fire that burns them will never be quenched.